Good evening. Welcome. I'm Richard Sommer, the Dean of the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design, and I'm also a professor here at the faculty. So, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. Before I get started, as has become our practice, I want to read a land acknowledgement. And so I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So tonight's event is part of our 2019-20 public programming series, which you see up here. It's called Hindsight 2020. Hindsight is 2020, which focuses on phenomena that have emerged since the turn of the millennium, and in particular phenomena that have changed the context for architecture, landscape architecture, art, forestry, and urban design, all of our disciplines at the faculty. So over the course of this semester and next semester, our speakers and exhibitions will explore how our disciplines continue to be transformed by upheavals in technology, politics, and the environment, and how reframing the recent past might help us better address the next 20 years and hopefully beyond. So tonight I'm particularly excited to present Architectures of Risk, which will feature a discussion between three compelling speakers whose work challenges perceived notions of architecture's role in our global society, and particularly in terms of economics. Architecture and architects are often thought of as being subject to the shifting forces of economics and politics. And for those of us that have been in the field for long enough, and we've seen a lot of up and down cycles of economics, about when it's easy to get a job, when it isn't easy to get a job, and how many people have had to reinvent themselves in that context. But this evening, we're going to explore how architecture might better become an instrument of risk management instead of being subject to economic risk, as something capable of wielding influence in its own right, and forging a mode of practice where the architect might have a stronger hand in creating the circumstances under which a building or a landscape can be created. Or to put it another way, how can a discipline that has traditionally been seen as or understood in cultural, artistic, and material terms be reconsidered by knowing more and being able to better master financial and socioeconomic factors? So, while coming from a place very different than Toronto, I think tonight's guests will bring insights into how architects might better take the means of production, if you will, into their own hands, and in so doing model a way of practicing that reconstructs our notions of what a client is and how particularly young firms or firms that are starting out might start with almost nothing or very little in terms of support from in patronage and begin to make an architecture of consequence nonetheless. Joining us tonight are Sebastian Adamo and Marcelo Faden from the architectural firm Adamo Faden. Also joining us is Jonathan Massey, who is the Dean and Professor of Architecture at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. In 2005, Adamo Faden established their practice in Buenos Aires, a city they have described as, quote, an ideal laboratory to mature as an architect, end quote. Their partnership has extended to the field of teaching and research, and their work has been internationally recognized by a variety of media and institutions. The work has also been exhibited around the world, including at the Guggenheim Museum in New York and the Chicago Architecture Biennial. Sebastian and Marcelo's creative approaches to design of housing and other, I would say, public landscapes shows how architects can, despite economic and political confines and challenges, ultimately drive meaningful change. By experimenting with With form and challenging known typologies, their firm has been able to test the accepted notions that influence typical approaches to housing at various scales, and we're going to see that tonight. Joining Sebastian and Marcelo is the architecture historian Jonathan Massey, as I said, who's the dean at University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. Jonathan, who I've known for many years, is an accomplished scholar of modern architecture and a leading authority on architecture and planning education. His research explores how architecture mediates power by forming civil society, shaping social relationships, and regulating consumption. That's actually, I think, a bit of a quote from Jonathan. His recent publications directly engage the questions I hope to be discussing tonight. For example, his book, Governing by Design, Architecture, Economy, and Politics in the 20th Century, which is a collection of essays brought together with his colleagues in the Aggregate Architecture History Collaborative, a group he co-founded actually with our former professor, Zane Chalik-Alexander. This book on governing by design questions architecture's role in modernization and societal change. Jonathan's latest book, Marcel Breuer, Building Global Institutions, shows how a, quote, leading Bauhaus and brutalist designer shaped the institutions of the 20th century society, end quote. So we're going to start off tonight's event with a kind of lecture and a presentation from Sebastian Marcelo. This will be followed by discussion or a response by Jonathan, and then a discussion that I'm going to moderate. If time permits, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So now, please join me in welcoming Sebastian Adamo and Marcelo Faden. You're going to lecture up here. You want to do it here? You want to stand? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, and thanks to all Daniel's faculty. We are very, very excited for being here. You have a very beautiful building and a very beautiful school. I think it's a good and very new crystallization between what a pedagogic project can do in a very precise building that is specifically done for that. And we're also very excited to share table with Jonathan and hope to share some ideas with him. We are going to talk about some project we did, but we would like to start talking about our short biography. We met in Buenos Aires in the late 90s, at the beginning, late 90s in the more or less 97. We started working together as students until the beginning of the new century. In that moment, our country was like going deep in a very we come from Argentina, and we were going deep in one of those crises we are very used to have. That collapse at the end of the 2001 year, and it was an institutional and an economic crisis that was the crack of the banking system and all. Which means that the banks stole the people money from their savings by doing a financial yard. So in that context, we were finishing our undergraduate studies, and we had the possibility to do a competition that we won, and it led us to win the prize. That was an invitation to study outside Buenos Aires. And we decided to go to Spain. It was a a very very specific decision we took, that we wanted to study at Barcelona, but we wanted to live in Madrid. That was kind of crazy for our physical situation, but we thought that both cities had a compound of what we wanted to be as an architect. So there we did our postgraduate studies, but more or less at 2004, we had the chance to think what we wanted to do, if we wanted to stay in the prominent Europe with all the power Spain had for architects, or if we wanted to get back to Buenos Aires, where everything was ready to be done. That was our decision, because we understood that the resurgence of the country opened a series of possibilities to develop. This crisis was a macroeconomic crisis, but in the very specific real estate market, the resurgence was based in three main reasons. In first chance, the crisis sank the value of properties. That was very, very, very important. Then, in the second, a segment of the society still had the chance in this resurgence to generate savings. So people were generating money, but they didn't trust in the banks. So that was a very important situation for the real estate market. And then the banks were completely out of the productive system. But these three conditions that were specific to that situation at that time were not the only engine to develop, because our society has another characteristics that are structural when we evaluate its development. So the crisis in Argentina happens every 10 to 10 years. So as we were talking before, it's a historical and psychological record for the mind of the people, because you know how to travel through crisis, and you're prepared for the next one. So that's a very important situation. So another thing is that people save their earnings in foreign money, in foreign currency. We all think, we have a very poor currency, so we think in other ways of saving your earnings, mainly in dollars. So for real estate properties, these are historically assimilated as a form of investment for the common people. So the properties are replacing with the place where people can put their savings. So then for all the result is a middle class people developing their own way to achieve a place to live or just to deposit their earnings. Based on these private ways of social organizations, the machine started to run again. But why architecture? Because we are talking about very, very typical situations of a poor conduct country, but why architecture? In this socioeconomic context, but also in this city, as you can see, we have this physiognomy of a city that is very, very hybrid, with very different heights of the building. It's a quadrant city, and we have these small plots where the city shares the spaces with buildings and with the houses. Some are industrial, some are commercial, So, and if you want to increase the size of your building, you can buy 2 plots or 3 plots, and this is like a very hybrid. You can have in 1 square, but that is by 80 by 80, you can have maybe 30 constructions from different owners, different people, different families. And if they go in height, you can have that. It's a very dense city. So we, as architects, as part of a determined group of colleagues, understood that our work should transcend the traditional task of the architect and become explorers in search of opportunities. So the city, with its particular conditions, was a perfect soil to develop and organize new ways of inhabiting and grow. So these small plots with very low prices, those roofs you see there with all houses below and a lot of air over it. But the most important thing is that all this infrastructure mixed with these big trees shape a perfect place to inhabit. We knew that if we could align the society needs with our private ambitions, I mean our agenda, the product conceived, the architecture, would be the crystallization of a very genuine condition. So our presentation is going to introduce these situations through the buildings and the opportunity we detect. And okay, let's see what the way each project develop in this environment.
So deciding what to do and where to do it are a creative question of the same tenor. Like a landscape painter 500 ago who walks to the countryside with his canvas and at some point put his finger and then decides this is interesting for me. I'm starting to painting right now. So setting a point of view is a project action for us. This picture talks a little bit about that. We understood that this landscape could be described as new plots that are actually floating in the air, that in reality there are infrastructure leftovers of all of the buildings. We discovered that they are very privileged places. They are in close relation to the sky, which is the only natural element that you can find in this extensive and massive landscape. You only know that you find a new point of view when you can make a redescription of an environment that you knew that you already knew. The first building I'm going to talk about is that one behind that vegetation. So this is a pavilion that steps back from the edge of the building in order to create a perimeter of plants that filters the light. We use the same structural design for two kinds of places. The one filter at exterior on my left, on your right, and the garden at interior. So its simplicity put it closer to a new version of Luchier primitive hut, but it's not actually built on the soil, but on top of the city, in the middle of it, with no urban references, with no preset rules, no specific use, just like a natural oasis related to a new kind of hedonism. Sometimes in perfect places, like this discontinuity between urban fabric, can develop new opportunities. Again, I'm talking about a new pavilion on top of an existing house, so there is no empty plot and no precise use. A very malleable element absorb every accident, as the diagram describes, of this discontinuity of neighbors' walls that stimulate the formalization of this shadow device. This is how it relates to the higher neighbor's wall. And here what you can see is that we used exactly the same attitude to obsolete infrastructure like we have in the previous project. An old water tank can be a pool floating in the air if we remove its top cover. This is how the city changes looking through the project. As architects, we can build passive machines that produce a small alteration in the weather. As you can see here, you don't need too much matter to do so. You can create a breeze, you can cool down the air, you can bring the vegetation's humidity inside. You can do it with very cheap materials, with a little effort. So it's a total different approach from traditional construction techniques. It's not like building a wall and a window, because elements here starts to share responsibilities. At that time they become lighter. So we can have this totally glass room just because we have a shadow device on top of it. I'm talking about this intermediate place that builds this new weather. As architects, we have to develop a new idea of luxury, but not related to expensive materials and not related to exclusive locations. So these are, as you can see in the bottom of the picture, these are the new plots that we are talking about. Sometimes unexpected way of living most of the time happen in unexpected places. So this pavilion presents itself most like a ghost roof, a roof that the previous house never had. So our hearth crust now is the urban fabric itself. If you work on an artificial topography, you can find a sloping new ground just in the middle of pampa, extremely plain soil. So this continuous sloping roof is a reaction to that condition. Again, a typical house already exists there, as you can see here. We are adding a big room with no specific use that is structured in 3 patios, one, the other on my left, and the other in front of us. So some metal mesh and glass try to dilute the differences between interior and exterior. We use the same concrete floor in both sides, the same steel structure, just to leave floated inside the block. So finally, when you manage to confirm the fertility of this new territory, and you finish understanding the hidden potentialities it contains, it's time to see the big picture again. We believe that the air plots are a key element to develop a new kind of social housing. This is a strategy that explodes the isolated housing block and prevents it from ghettification. It's also a strategy that promotes social integration through the integration of different architectures. So, as in the mutualism of animal kingdom, it is completely necessary to generate a new contract between the two parties, the one on top and the one on the bottom. So the new inhabitants can be integrated into a consolidated social network that already exists, while the owners of the existing home benefits from the air rights. Or you can add more urban activity. This urban activity can grow considerably by incorporating housing in services areas. And also you can see how the plants here grows at the same time that the roof of the existing house do the same. Or the elderly can avoid moving from the houses where they former their family by adding a new life on the rooftop. As you can see in this image over there, we don't believe that social architecture really exists. The architecture we propose is identical to the previous one. What we do believe is that there is a potential social change in the detection of new territories.
Okay, so this new chapter is about two small projects that can exist because of the solidarity of the families. The families, in this case, were able to share part of their heritage with children, contributing with a piece of land, in this case the equity, and with part of the needed budget, the capital. So the first case is this house. Is in Floresta, which is a hybrid neighborhood in our city, which is a mix of small and low-impact industry with the domestic life. As you can see here, I don't know if you can point there. Yeah, okay. Here, this is the neighbor, which is a production factory in the ground floor, and upstairs is the owner's home. And here is our building. So the plots, as I said before, in our city are deep and narrow, like this one. This family owns a factory. This is a low production factory that fits in a very small plot, with a spare space with an old house in the front of it. So the first step was to demolish the front house, to leave a space for the grown children's new house. What is interesting in this case that we are having a new plot, a new opportunity inside another plot. It's a subdivision of the original property. So that's why the building is very narrow with a vertical growth. We are inserting density in a very low upgrade. So now the Lago family shares in the same plot their work and two houses, which are for these now grown children. So in the ground floor here, we have a shared place where people can go ahead to the existing factory, and they have another place to get the access to the house, as you can see here. And the typical floor are very, very small apartments, and they have in the common space a lemon tree, which is a kind of micro-landscape episode that was very important for the family because they have their life under that tree. So that tree was what started to organize all this shared space. Then the construction, the building is a very economic construction, but with a material palette that resists long term without maintenance. Here you can see the building that's very, very narrow. And always the economy of media is the best path to be economic. So all the decisions we did were very strategic to make comfort inside the house with a very few elements. This is an intermediate space between the street and the house. It was very needed because of the direct relationship with the street. And the roof is a place where both brothers and their children now earn this domestic life in contact with the sky and the city landscape. This is a very similar essay. This is for another family, the family Martos. In this case, the new house is at the front of the parents' existing house, just where the garage was located. So in this, again, a narrow plot, the family had their house at the back, and in the front for the cars. So they decided to give their children a piece of land and to build their new house. And this is a typical suburban situation where tertiary buildings like this coexist with big portions of air and land like this one. So by rotating the new house, it's possible to conquer long open views and connect the air delivered by this piece of landscape with the new house and the private courtyard. So the small courtyard that works as an expansion for both family with a covered entrance and the shared space for the cars. So by elevating the new house main rooms, we can provide some privacy for the existing one. So accepting the challenge and taking care of how can the new building join an ongoing conversation was the principal task we wanted to conquer. This piece of landscape that is a very lovely maintained by the family. It's a place that works very good for both family to share. So them again in the interiors, very simple details, very economic building. And the interior is a big portion of air where the furniture plays a very important role to define how it's used. And the big glass front is organized with the two types of glass to provide the required intimacy for both families. So the last room in this promenade is an open-air observatory where both families can share the experience of rediscovering their own neighborhood. This time is from another point of view.
Well, in this series, we are using the whole plot, finally. We are using the land. As Sebastian commented in the introduction, Buenos Aires is made of small plots that facilitate its quick regeneration. For various reasons, there is a solid confidence of the citizens of Buenos Aires in their architects. So if you agree to take certain risks, you can participate in the construction of your city. In this way, the project expands considerably. It begins much earlier, includes the question of where to do it and what to do, issues that are usually given to us before starting to work. This is the first building we managed to build under this methodology that very briefly is like this. So we look for a piece of land that was for sale, and we made a project that nobody asked for it. And then we looked for possible interested parties. Those parties bought the piece of land and paid for the construction. So what we did is choose an area of the city where it made sense to build small units, units that were in tune with the small investors that we were able to group at that time, most of them close friends. It is a simple economical building where the first block, as you can see in the section, rises and connects the street to the circulation patio. The interesting thing about this method of work is that the first thing that appears is the project. Architecture then has the possibility of placing itself between your private obsessions, your practice agenda, and the public's need, using Richard Rorty's words. If this balance is not 100% perfect, the construction of the project does not happen, or maybe the architecture is not interested. So this space speaks a little bit of this double condition. Some people can see it as a parking, and others can see it as a common ground in continuity with public space. Some people can see this space as a home. Some people can see it for space for working, while we only care about creating spaces that increase freedom, unrelated to any specific use or unrelated to any specific inhabitant. We ask ourselves how a building of which we don't know its future use should be presented to the city, or how this programmatic uncertainty can positively impact in its formalization. In the end of the day, the only thing that we are offering is a modified volume of air. So how can we project the condition of that interior atmosphere? The design of the envelope becomes a key moment of the project. In this case, the shadow device and the vegetation are incorporated. The air enters to the room, lowers its temperature, and increases its humidity. This programmatic uncertainty is opposed to a clear spatial specificity. This is the condition to promote a creative way of living. From this point of view, the space organization is dramatically simplified. You can come back to it with a different perspective, as you can see in the section and the plans. This perspective is a really shortcut to structure an envelope and just it. But then it's possible to concentrate your efforts on proposing another generation of buildings able to dialogue with natural elements of the city. Maybe this project is the crystallization of this agenda. This is a new version of those elevated gardens with 6-foot width. It's another version of this hybrid and ventilated curtain wall. It's a collection of stacked rooms open to different appropriations. This is one of those gardens. Behind that permeable curtain wall, behind that elevated garden, behind that glass, again, there is a big volume of air circulating from side to side, waiting for its occupation. The plan of this building is organized in strips, a technical strip in the middle, garden in the perimeter, and open space in between. So the roughness of this construction changes radically when it is appropriated by its inhabitants. They can have a workplace like this, or they can dwell like this. A very important idea is that the furnitures decrease the use. This is now a house only because the things we found inside. But to doing so, you have to offer unregulated spaces. You have to step back and let life, with all its surprises and contradictions, come inside our organizations. So this building would be a typology evolution of the kind of building that Buenos Aires is made of. More permeable, more open to different uses.
Okay, so the last chapter is about how this process ends in with big companies gaining trust in the people and replacing banks in the financing system. So the professionalization of the buildings that Marcelo talked recently was including the intelligence of more multidisciplinary teams into the organization of those buildings. So these are buildings with a new scale, larger scale, where developers get in the role to make them. So the scale of these buildings have the ability to bring a new value to some sectors of the city that were not seen with interest before. So for us, it's an opportunity to capture the interest of the society to live again in the city and to come back from the suburbs. By doing a redescription of all buildings typology, which insert now a new density. As you can see here, with this new building that is a simple redescription of its neighbor, but in this case with a larger density. So taking advantage of this generous public space that was with a low rate use, these compact buildings works as if it were a backdrop curtain for the existing trees, and it gets ahead of the plaza. So the organization is in one single block facing the plaza, with the section divided in two in this way. We're having the building with a typology as it were like small houses, with a section that is one house at the top with a good connection to the skies through its own terrace, and on the other house with this situation to connection from the back up to the front of it. So all the units are organized to earn a diaphanous connection between the front and the back, turning the interiors into a place that can be understood as an interstitial space between the square we saw at the beginning and the private interior courtyard. So common spaces are reduced to its minimum, and here you can see all this kind of collection, the collection of spaces that begin in the back with this private patio, the interior, your private garden, and then the exterior again. So all the connections between interior and interior are very open, and you can regulate the kind of dialogue you want to have with the exterior. And also in the private ambience, you can have a regulation of your own privacy because you're living in front of a public space. Also, when you are in the upper units, you can have this portion of air. This is a kind of new luxury for living in the city. Or in this case, in a whole new urbanization where we were invited by a developer to build the first mid-density block of the development. So the block is next to the Civic Square, which is here. And the main institutional building, this is the main institutional building of the city. So instead of thinking the block as a consolidated solid, we work with a group of buildings arranged in such a way that the central open space here can be opened and shared with the rest of the community by these connections. Also, each building is positioned to build specific relationships with its surrounding, like this, that is the plaza building, or this big lake here that has the residential buildings, or here with some commercial in the corners and these townhouses here. So each of these three buildings are designed for a very precise type of inhabitants with different needs. So the buildings are also an evolution of some other experiences we had before, like the diffused Marcelo was talking with a very open spaces for different type of inhabitants, and this in this case is mainly for the developer who wants this product for a rental, because are small units where people stay for not a long term in their lives. This is the connection between the three buildings with a big roof over the parking. And the other building, which is the apartments in front of the lake, with the generous expansions, because these apartments has the best view. So the people who want to live here are want to have a type of life very connected to the surroundings. And this product is another type of financing for the developers, because as these buildings is all pre-ordered, they finance for the people through all the construction. And the commercial and leisure spaces are in the corner, so it activates the use of the public space. Or the townhouses, which are this one, which is a low ticket houses that are for families that can't approach a house with a plot in another part of the city. So the buildings have different materializations, and the way each building presents itself to the rest of the city, but they have also very similar construction techniques. And the last project, which is a kind of loop we are doing from the very beginning to we started with the collapse of the financial system, and now we are finishing with a building that maybe needs a bank to be financed, but in our city, this is a very different situation. This is a tower that is going to be built in the encounter between the oldest and the newest neighborhood of the city, so it's the downtown, and it's designed for young professionals and students. We are now living a new crisis in our country, but now the volatility is pretty much bigger, as I said before, because people react very fast to any disturbance in the macroeconomy, so the money moves in very fast moves. For developers, these moves are opportunities for doing business. So once again, these opportunities are a perfect occasion for us to test new ways of living and of living collectively in the city. So going back to the project, the figure of the tower is a reaction for the stimulation of surroundings, and it proposes a dialogue between the urban silhouette and the neighborhood and its own hybrid form. The tower figure is made of this displacement that the tower makes, that is used to incorporate a special program that activates the collective use of it, turning what could be a typical stack of apartment floors into a new way of inhabiting collectively in the contact with the city. So this big collection of variations are introduced into each typology to fit the commercial request of the developer. So we decided to think the tower more like an office building with a central core and a structural envelope to leave space to multiple interior configurations and future changes. But the main thing, the most important places are those that are the common spaces where people can share. So let's take a short tour through these common spaces, like this roof terrace with the swimming pool and another bucolic garden, or the second floor, which is an open-air living room, which is a place for parties for young, and a collective kitchen, or going down to under the cantilever with the 14th floor with a multi-purpose classroom, and a collective library to study, or in the 6th floor, the open-air leisure for doing sports and and spaces to bring closer sports to the daily life. And the most important part, which is the ground floor, with an urban passage, as in the old towers of our city, with commercial activities that is open to all inhabitants. And a public squares where these activities and the activities of the community that lives in the tower merge with the rest of the society. So this is the square with a reinterpretation of the classical gardens of Buenos Aires. So now the tower is like a good excuse where we could link the private needs from in this case a big developer and the other interest that we have to develop in the way of living we have in the city. So thank you.
I'll ask Jonathan to make a response, and then we'll see if we can get some heat going.
All right, thank you, and hello, Daniel's folks. It's great to be back here in a school that I really cherish, and it's great to spend an evening looking at such subtle, refined, and delicate, yet seemingly sturdy and robust architecture simultaneously. I'll say a little bit about how I have thought about housing and architectures of risk by way of establishing a bit of an interpretive framework, and then turn to you guys and your work more with questions probably than with hypotheses. So my interest in the relationship of housing to risk started in a way with Buckminster Fuller, with looking at Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion houses and some of his other projects, and coming to appreciate that in designing a portable, mobile, lightweight, mass-produced house that could be a single-family house or could be aggregated, stacked into a multifamily housing unit, that Fuller was actually trying to redesign, to make corrections to the negative externalities of capitalism. That he was essentially trying to redesign the distribution of risk in a way that anticipated, I think, what sociologists talk about in the last decade or two as the risk society, a moment in which the distribution of exposure to risks has become a lot more complicated, nuanced, and central driver of politics. I'm assuming that some of you have encountered this risk society hypothesis or theory, but that others won't have, so I'll just say a couple words about it. This is an analysis that says that one of the hallmarks of industrial modernism up to let's say the late 1970s was the formation of risk-sharing communities, like the nation state, or especially the welfare state that peaked after World War II in a lot of countries, unions, corporations that had robust employment contracts where you might expect to work for the same company for most of your career and have a defined benefits pension to support you in retirement. That these large-scale 20th century institutions were risk-sharing communities that shielded individuals from having to do a whole lot of individual or family scale management of their economic risk, their exposure to volatility and fluctuations, whether in the currency or in the labor market. And so these sociologists say that since the 1970s, in a phenomena of deregulation and neoliberalization, that actually the people have been a lot more exposed to risk, environmental risk, economic risk, financial risks, employment risks. We now are much more called upon to manage our health and our financial well-being and our retirement savings at an individual and household level, rather than being protected by these risk-sharing systems. And so Buckminster Fuller intentionally tried to redesign this. And one of the ways to think about the Dymaxion house is as an exercise in giving workers the same mobility that capital had in a capitalist economy. So I have spent 2 years now in Michigan, where the news every day is often about a GM strike or the closure of a auto manufacturing plant in Ohio. The kind of negotiation of these legacies of capital mobility, where the jobs that created middle-class communities in the manufacturing economy are offshored or are automated or otherwise relocated. Fuller recognized in the 1920s that workers, through home ownership, were tied down to the land, and that when employment shifted its geography, often the workers were trapped by their investment in land and community in places they didn't necessarily possess the mobility of capital. And the house, if you could pick up your house and airlift it to a new place, I'm simplifying a little bit, but workers could follow the jobs. They could have just as much navigational mobility for global geographies of opportunity as capital did. So that's sort of what got me interested in the financialization of housing and looking at actually how do our houses mediate our participation in these larger economies and labor markets and land markets. And so to jump forward to the present, when the context that you guys are working in, I've looked a fair amount about how over the last 40 years, but especially the last 2 decades maybe, the way, at least in the United States, for middle-class people, home ownership has been an intensive site of financial self-management, of managing risk, of economic volatility, and of building up savings for retirement. So the liberalization of credit since the 1980s allowed a lot of middle-class people to borrow heavily to purchase housing. Home equity lines of credit and home equity loans were an early manifestation of this that allowed people to expand their houses, to increase their investment in real estate, counting on the real estate to appreciate in value and generate wealth that then could fuel someone through retirement or a precarious job market. And then the huge liberalization of credit leading up to 2008 extended that massively, and brought a lot of people into the home ownership economy who had been excluded before. But it also allowed people to speculate in real estate on borrowed money and to buy more house than they needed because they wanted to maximize their investment in real estate, or to buy multiple houses and so forth. And we're now in an age of deep political critique of the instability and the risk that exposed people to, and exposed them to differentially. So there's a growing discourse that draws from the theory of racial capitalism to look at how subprime lending and the liberalization of credit actually became a predatory mechanism to exploit communities of color, people who had African American and other folks in the U.S. who had been denied access to credit through redlining, and so had not been able to buy houses, were suddenly able in the early 2000s with liberal credit and no down payment mortgages to buy housing. And then in 2008, the value of that housing dropped precipitously, and they were stranded with lots of debt and a poor asset. And so there's now a huge growing conversation, and there's one about student debt and educational debt that's kind of similar, actually, about how credit and home ownership have actually exacerbated racial disparities, the wealth gap, racialized wealth gaps, and have actually worsened some of the demographic inequalities in U.S. society. And so for me, there's a really rich conversation to be had, and people are having it in a whole bunch of different ways as designers and also as sociologists and political theorists about what are the ways that living and furnishing a place to live can, of necessity, is also a way of positioning yourself relative to the opportunities and risks of a neoliberal society. And the last thing I'll say in this part before maybe kicking it back to you guys, Sebastian and Marcelo, is I've been fascinated over the last couple of years at the way, I think particularly for my students, but for people in general, the U.S. political conversation, it feels like the pendulum might be shifting back from the deregulatory kind of neoliberal impetus that we've had since at least the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, shifting back with the new interest in democratic socialism. And my students are reading Jacobin magazine and other sources for understanding people who are making the case for a very different relationship between housing and the economy, for a return to genuinely social housing and public housing. The foreclosed exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art a couple of years ago was one intervention in this direction, thinking about a new contract between the state and its citizens, mediated through housing. And so there's I think a whole group of people who are thinking about architecture intentionally creating other frameworks, either to help people participate more effectively in a risk economy, like through the creation of accessory dwelling units and micro units that might allow people to buy into the market at a lower price point and become mini capitalists, or duplex units that would allow homeowners to buy a place to live but also have a rental unit, and so could become, have an income stream from rent. And on the other hand, people in the sort of Pierre Vittorio Aureli, Jack Self, Niraj Bhatia, Antje Steinmuller camp, who are, and many others, who are reimagining collective living outside of the capitalist property ownership market, and are looking to the legacies of monasteries and boarding houses and Soviet communal housing and many other sources to suggest that we form risk-sharing communities once again, or in new ways, looking at limited equity cooperatives and collective land banks, community land trusts, to think about, to highlight the capacity for us to form communities protecting one another from risk and volatility. And so to hand it back to you guys, it seems to me that you talked about your projects a little bit in the former group that I just mentioned, which is sort of thinking, how can a small scale, how can a family or a 28-year-old who's just starting to have enough income to think about home ownership. It seems like you presented the works the buildings you've designed as creating those niche for people to participate in the economy at a very small scale, so that they can get their money out of a crappy, fucked up, volatile banking system into a tangible asset that has use value, like a house. And that with the last project you showed, you're a little bit looking, I don't know if that's a rental unit or a condo building, but we have a lot of buildings like that in the U.S. that are essentially rental properties and are for prosperous millennials, and they borrow from the dream of communal living, but commodify it. And so it seems like your work is participating in this economy in sort of those two different ways.
It's open, yes. It's working in different ways, but at the end of the day, the people that are inhabiting those buildings are very similar. Because as you don't have all the institutional financial loans, it's people that are middle class with some earnings that can afford a house. So we have very big problems that are all the people that are not in the lecture, that they can't be inside the system. So for some of those occasions, we try to think in a way of building these opportunities, and as we do in small plots with the small groups, the developers think for bigness, no? For a big portion of the society, but the people are the same. So as a society, we have big problems because of this kind of organization. I don't know if you want to add something, but so through all the process, what we try to understand is the people needs and how to go do a step ahead and to imagine a new way of living, of inhabiting together that can be specific to these opportunities that are being built.
For me, this whole mess we are talking about, the most important or interesting thing to approach to it, it's how we architects try to dilute into design techniques. What do we do how would you translate it to project? Because at the end of the day, we can learn and we must learn to play by the rules of our city, of our world. But our approach is going to be valuable only if we can transform it into architecture. And you put Buckminster Fuller into the table, and that made me think a little about what we are doing about mobility, because the changes that we've been talking about are radically growing all the time, from economy and also from the ways of living. And the only very little parallel I can make with Bucky's project is that maybe we are not talking about houses, and we are not talking about offices, and we are just talking about structures. Or we really use the word pavilion, and we try to make a big effort to remove the content. So what it moves from our point of view is just the furniture, just the use of the spaces. I mean, this school is a big example of how can we redevelop a structure. So the structure don't have to move anymore, but our properties or our elements.
So I was thinking a lot about the furniture during your presentation. Were you guys struck by all of the, like how little there was, and how it was little inflatable kiddie pools and folding patio chairs and potted plants,
and some stuff you can get at a vintage store.
And yes, but I found myself thinking, I was getting a very contradictory reading from your work, and I'd be fascinated to hear what you all made of this. On the one hand, thinking that the very limited possessions that are all could be packed up in an hour and moved, is a little bit of a sad commentary on precarity and the tenuousness of the residents' claim on this space, that they may be moving on tomorrow. And on the other hand, it seemed like maybe part of a poetics of decommodification and disinvestment in the ownership of belongings in favor of the pleasures of light, shadow, spatial proportion, some of the qualities that your architecture cultivates at a very high level.
If I can just glom onto that, we've on occasion had some very, shall we say, aesthetically driven Japanese architects lecture at the faculty, and they're always showing houses they do for clients, and there's never anything in them, but we all know they have a storage shed in the back with all their stuff. So is there more stuff?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay.
Of course. This is a kind of theatrical work we do we manage their own objects. We don't bring objects to the photograph, so that's legitimate. But we manage like a kind of manipulation of what they own and the way we want to see it through our point of view. So there are a lot of stuff inside there.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Jonathan, you sort of sketched out, you started with Buckminster Fuller, which basically I think of his work in a kind of, post-war, Cold War, shall we say, nuclear society mode, where, you're not sure whether someone has to travel with their house because they're traveling to get another job, that's the risk they're avoiding, or whether there's been some sort of military incident and they have to drive down the highway, down the interstate to somewhere else. But the vision is very disaggregated, and it's very suburban in terms of the densities. Because, of course, if we had a more robust rental system in North America, and it differs in different cities, it's very easy to have a job in one place if you're renting, and then to give up that place and move somewhere else. In that light, I thought what was interesting about I sort of would parse your projects and presentations slightly differently. You intentionally you scaled them up from the smallest to the largest, and the first couple classes, I forget what you called them, groupings, were really in the mode of air rights.
Yes.
What we call air rights in North America. You get a property and you maximize what you can build above it. And there was that interesting moment when you said, well, here's what you take it and you make it into a bigger thing. And the air right, you aggregate a property and they jump one to the next. That's, one can imagine, because we're talking about different economies and different cultures and different contexts, but certainly in a place like Toronto, even in a suburban landscape, one can imagine a bottom-up intensification in that manner, where basically you take the existing structures and you maximize air rights, but at a certain scale. Then there was a middle scale of project, which was, let's say, 4 to 6 stories, which were also air rights in nature, but I think we're leveraging, let's say, zoning between two different kinds of things. Then what you didn't explain, so we could talk about those things, about the air rights, but then beyond that, when the projects got to another scale and they were new projects, to my mind, we're looking at a whole different economy, scale of investment, probably different client and different when I mean client in terms of who's building it, and also potential occupant. So could you speak to that a little bit? Because where you got to the end was much closer to what we've been seeing, in Toronto. These kind of condominiums. We could have a whole conversation about the difference between the condominium you're proposing and the hundreds that have built here, which also have all these collective rooms, but they're different. But let's start with the smaller scale and this idea of maximizing air rights, which of course have a different character in Buenos Aires because of the sun, but still are a kind of basic operation of maximizing value.
Yeah. Most of the experience that we show here, they are related to people who want to buy a house in the city, who wants to live in the middle of the city, who want to go to outside to have a garden and have the effort to drive 1 hour to the city and 1 hour back. So the task that they gave to us was how can we bring something of the exterior of the city into it, and in a few cases we looked to the structure and talked to them on which they should buy. And we discussed the program and the location at the same time. But the main thing was to add to the existing architecture no more square meter in a very speculative way, but to add new rooms, new stances that didn't exist in the ordinary organizations.
So that's still for one family or one grouping.
Exactly.
Those aren't auxiliary units.
Exactly.
So there's probably not that many people in the room that remember this, but there was a really bad television show in the 1960s and 70s called Green Acres. And the theme introduction to this show had I forget that was it Eddie Albert was the actor. There was a farmer who married this kind of Zsa Zsa Gabor, and so they had this argument. He wanted to live on the farm, and she wanted to live in the city. And he'd say fresh air, and she'd say Times Square. And so it seems to me you made this statement. We want to redefine the notion of luxury.
Exactly.
And your redefinition of the notion of luxury is to go into the city, is to live essentially in the city, in Times Square, but bring this kind of suburban ideal or pastoral condition to that. Would that be an accurate?
Yes, but with no nature, with no mimicking other place, not making a model of what you cannot do, but trying to discover a new landscape that in our city is most of the time the sky.
Well, it's akin to, let's say, Le Corbusier's Unité, where he condensed all the units into a block and then created this kind of really a kind of surreal artificial landscape on the roof,
Yes.
which constructs a relationship to the sky.
Totally, yes.
So you're creating that on an incremental basis through the maximization of the air rights of these properties.
Exactly.
So that's the first class of projects.
Exactly.
But then there was another one after that, which is about
Fragmentation.
which was about colonizing more. No.
Or fragmentation of in one block, adding another piece of architecture.
I think the whole presentation is about subdivisions,
Mm-hmm.
because how do you subdivide an existing property, the plots, the air, the density, the collective parts of a building. So I think instead of thinking, because we were talking about that when we are doing the presentation, we were not thinking about bigness or how it grows in scale, because some things are bigger than others. For instance, one of the houses is bigger than the last building, but you can't notice that because we are not focusing there. We are just focusing in how these spaces can approach bigger conditions of comfort. So then we focus in the pavilions Marcelo was talking about, and then in the buildings, maybe in the perimeter, and how you can maximize the relationship between interior exterior. And yes, there is some kind of speculation in those places, which are like where the intellectual speculation mixed with the money speculation. I think it's a crystallization between our works mixed with the clients.
Yes, all of our problems that we are happy to have. Okay, we are happy to have the problem of how can we add new idea of luxury on top of the city. We are happy to invent new typologies by fragmentation of the existing plot and doing very tall and small buildings that we like. So what we do, it would be a big mistake to understand our work just a response to a given problem. It's not like that.
So one thing you didn't talk about, we had these conversations before you came. I was trying to explain Toronto's housing boom, the problems of affordability, the way that projects are financed here, and how that limits the way one can build and what one can build. And so what was a little bit hidden in your presentation is you talked a little bit about, not much about the clients, but also not about how these things are built, because from what I understand, especially in the smaller scale of projects, you built some of them yourself.
Exactly.
You got the builders. You made all the arrangements. You weren't the consultant to other people who did that. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes.
Either of you?
Well, in order to survive.
Yes, this is important, especially for our students to hear.
Yes, of course. So our economy is very
volatile.
Volatile. Sorry?
Volatile.
Volatile. So it changes every time. So and you have to be an expert. Not an expert, but to know a little bit of everything. Sometimes if we want to make a small project and get out of it without putting money, you have to take some risks and do as much as you can. But not just because of the money you want to earn, but the complexity of the building you want to get built. If we put this project into contractor hands, it won't be possible to be built. Or it will be a big
because
effort.
of the expectations they bring to the project, or because of their economic model. Right?
Exactly.
It's a problem also what we are doing is concentrating all the responsibilities of all the process of the building to be built in one head, that is our office. So because of the scale of the plots, that's the scale of the buildings. So we are talking about a very, very small construction that for the people to get more, to be more affordable, we have to take the risk of doing it all ourselves.
What does that mean, doing it all yourselves? I mean, just
we should take the car, look for the city, we choose a plot, we imagine what kind of a building, and we do numbers. We imagine who can pay the plot. We look for those
investors.
Friends.
Yeah.
That are investors and that can buy some. That we join them 2 or 3, and they buy the plot. Or more or less, the capability of them is and the interest they have is because they can have an acquisition of the property very cheap because they're in the very beginning. And then we do all the project, the presentations, all the architecture.
But this is the way that this. I mean, just to be provocative, this is the way that someone begins to become a real estate developer.
Yes.
Typically, right?
Yes.
The difference is that we step outside. We have all the time to have a perspective, to be critical. We don't have the money to buy a piece of land, and if we have it, we won't use it because we have to keep our critic distance to it. It makes risk.
But I don't know how it is in Argentina, but in North America and in Canada and Toronto in particular, developers don't develop projects with their own money either. Well, they basically they bring the value added. They bring the architect. They bring the expertise. They bring a little bit of their own money, but they're using other people's money, right?
Yes. But there's a very, very big difference with at least with
That's what I'm trying to tease
Well,
out here.
yeah, okay. Well, a very big difference with the developers, at least in our country, is that we love architecture over money, and they do the invert. They love money over architecture. So that's very important to mention, because we all do all this mess just to be here talking with you about architecture and about the buildings. And we love our buildings, and we love our work, and we want to have a discussion about that, and we want to do architecture that changes the city. So we know that we have to put our feet in the mud to do that, and we have to talk with the investors, with people. We have to dialogue, to change, to do better architecture, but through that way, because if not, we only would be in the practice doing like houses for riches.
I think it would be a huge contribution to architectural pedagogy and teaching and learning if you could describe the back and forth between your designer intelligences and eyes and hands and your small-scale capitalist Excel spreadsheets and financing structures and sales regimes, because representing that would be an incredibly educational and informative act for those of us who want to advocate for the kind of architectural values and aesthetic values that you bring, but figure out how they make it through, how they navigate the path of real estate development. And just to kind of correlate the pro forma and the spreadsheet and the financing sequence with, you know, the plans that you show and the spatial qualities would be really quite a learning experience, I think, for not just for students but for architects as well.
Yeah. I think this whole control of the situation, what gave us is more freedom. So what we use is this freedom to practice the architecture we want to. We are sure that can make a new product for the city, but also that can dialogue with the market. So that is very important for us. And at the end, all the last projects are the same way, but they're
Bigger ones, you mean?
the bigger ones, because we are not doing we are not in all the casilleros, in all the spaces of the process, but we know what they are doing. So
Making sometimes little corrections.
Yeah. So
We have an horizontal dialogue. We are not the architects that want to do something that is impossible, and there is no that kind of battle between good architecture and the market.
Yeah.
So let me give you an interesting example. Getting down to this kind of scale of architecture that I was struck by, and that project is not built yet, the tower.
No.
Okay, so in Toronto, we're building, I mean, the units aren't as flexible and as open as the ones you're showing there, but there are hundreds of condominiums of various heights that are being built. And one of the failures, in my view, of many of these buildings is they have a formula, they have a concrete fly construction type. So if you strip away all the facades, they're all very similar in their layout. But one of the things is all of the systems come down through the core of the building, and then they have to land in the base of the building. And you go and you see the public spaces and the retail spaces, and they are encumbered by all of the systems. And they also are unwilling to make the ground floor have the height that you're showing there because it costs money.
Yeah.
So you have these fantastic buildings. Some of them have, you know, private spaces with theaters and gyms, and you go into the base of them that is really the main public space, and they are architecturally compromised to an extent that makes them, not suitable for many things, in my view, because of this very bottom line thinking. So just getting some of our developers to think about making, investing in the public space at the base of the building and making it have the proportions and quality that you're proposing there would be a big thing. And I'm intrigued to see whether you're going to be able to do that in Buenos Aires.
We are too into it too.
Yeah.
I mean, because basically you think that would be a main space of investment, but basically it's just an exchange space to get the systems to the city, right?
Yes.
And it's becoming more and more expensive to do that.
Yeah. But this city was also made of those kinds of operations. If we take a look to the relation between Albert Greenwald and Mies van der Rohe, Albert Greenwald and Mies van der Rohe, the developer and the architect, or how Gordon Bunshaft with the first towers of Manhattan invented the plaza and the tower in order to get more space, more height.
Yes. They use that. That's an interesting example for those of you in the audience. In New York, the change in the zoning law, which used to be, Hugh Ferris-like, where the buildings would step back for light, went to this kind of plaza, the kind of Seagram model.
Exactly.
And developers got credits for creating public space. A colleague of mine who's a lawyer wrote a book, Privately Owned Public Space, because those spaces would appear to be public, but they weren't. They weren't. But it was the architects, in a way, working with these individual developers that pioneered that zoning that the city then adopted, right? Exactly. That's an example of what you're talking about.
Yes, it's all the time, it's architect playing with the rules, but playing in a different way. It's not about breaking the rules or claiming against, but again, choosing a new perspective to the same rules that everybody uses.
Take a few questions.
Yeah, let's hear from them.
Okay. Anyone have a burning question?
Yeah.
Professor Piper has a question. In the middle.
Thank you. I guess this is kind of a continuation or extension of some of the questions that Richard and Jonathan had brought up, because I do think it's fascinating to see how, I guess, in a certain kind of economic transitions, that new projects, that you have to kind of invent your work for yourself. And maybe this is the point, perhaps, that Richard had mentioned about maybe what is interesting for young architects or students to imagine in conditions where clients and projects aren't flying your way, that you somehow kind of have to make your own way sometimes. And it got me thinking about an architect I know from back where I'm from. He basically went around the city driving his car and found these kind of leftover plots that were unbuildable because the shape was too weird, and you basically couldn't fit the kind of standard development formula onto them. And so he managed to kind of cobble together cash, and he built some small buildings on them and ended up renting or selling them out. And I think that's what you guys are describing with some of your work, and I'm curious to know if is the kind of stuff you're making things that wouldn't normally be built using kind of a typical development model? Was there an idea about the fact that you had to kind of not just invent a kind of facade for the building, but invent a new building type in order to take advantage of property or that was otherwise unbuildable or otherwise?
Of course not. I think that we needed to make these experiments in the very beginning and to trust in ourselves and to be in the position of the developer, the constructor, and in that way to make our own platform of our experience to get the risk passed. Yes, we took the risk, and now when we work with developers, we have these other projects that are like shoulders where we can stand on, and it's very useful. But at the beginning, we had other shoulders also, other architects' experience, that we were very pragmatic using other experiences. So when we needed to be more strong to have support to take other risk, we did it, and we do it every day, because we all have a first time in something. Now we have our first time in a tower, and we have discussions, and we have to put in the table other experiences that say, okay, no, you're not going to have a risk with this because this is done in this place, in another place, or so. Our agenda is always mixed with others, and I think that is something very important to work with.
I mean, it's very obvious, but it's worth pointing out one of the most interesting things aesthetically about the whole range of projects is that when you went from a very small plot all the way up to this tower, there's a commonality to the elements of the architecture and to the kind of experience in living in these spaces, from one to the next, and you wouldn't see that here, because the way people occupy a townhouse and the way people occupy a condominium is quite different, and the aesthetic of them is somewhat different. So I found that very intriguing, this attempt to create a kind of atmosphere which permeates across all these scales. Other questions?
Hi, thank you for your lecture. And I really appreciated the sort of landscape territories that you created around the edges of the, especially the small buildings and the medium-sized buildings. My question is really about another kind of risk that we see in development here in Toronto. You might look around and get a sense that we can build at will, in a way, whatever we want if you look at certain parts of the city. But we actually have a kind of a risk that we experience in almost every project here in Toronto, which is called planning risk, which is really a product of the fact that most of the buildings that you would see in our downtown are not anticipated by any regulatory regime or any plan. They're all one-offs and special
Negotiations.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, those, especially with the smaller projects, are they within the realm of what's already permitted from a regulatory or zoning perspective, or do you have to, in a sense, create or find opportunities for those kind of spaces that are sort of beyond what's currently anticipated in the, let's say, the planning rules for those neighborhoods?
Should we say the truth?
That would be good.
Okay. Most of them are outside, the small ones are outside the law.
Well, and I would say, just as a response to that, so are all of the big ones that we're building here. They're all outside of the law, but there's a process.
No, but it's inside because they changed the law. They pay for the new law.
Yeah, but the way we get in or outside the law is not because the building could not be done. It's maybe part of the
rush of
the rush of making it, or maybe you can have done those pavilions in 6 months, and the permits last 1 year. So if we say to the owner, okay, you have to wait 1.5 years, it won't happen. So we translate the problem, and some of them are like very short experimental spaces that can be done very, very quickly, and some of them are in places that the law is not that important because there are no regulations. For instance, that White House that was like rotated from the front of the street, that the neighbor that is taller, it was infringing the law. So what we did is to cover the party wall. So
You mean the larger structure next
yeah,
to it?
the next to it.
Yeah.
So
They objected to it or not? The
sorry.
neighbor objected to the project, or?
No problem.
But you could see that project is basically just an extension of the zoning
Yes.
of that piece.
Yes.
So
We invented.
so that's I think what you're saying is that site might not have allowed the zoning, but if you view it as an extension of the adjacent zoning.
Yes.
no
Yeah.
problem.
Exactly.
There is this zone is a kind of lack of zone, and what we did is an interpretation of our zoning.
Yes, but
so,
of course, even here, the law, architecture is a subject of negotiation, and the law is even more so.
yes.
Yes.
Mark knows this.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I think Valeriano.
We'll take one or two more because we're over time, but baking underneath.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your talk. I always have to say, I come from the anthropology department down the road. When you were sort of showing, I really sort of found it very interesting, and I kept on thinking about Lucrezia Martel Llama, and sort of a very sort of well-known film director from Argentina, and her notions, from Zama, not Llama, Zama, the kind of nature that gets at you, that kind of film is so powerful about the fear of nature eating you over, which is a question also of the colonial Argentina. It's an imagination. So I'm really interested in the way, again, I'm not an architect, but I'm really interested in the way even of the plans that you're using in this kind of green spaces. Because, that kind of air right, I like that term, I think we'll have to borrow it. Air right, there is also a sanitization of nature that becomes kind of quite reproducible instead of, tropical plant. I mean, in Buenos Aires, perhaps they will not live that much, but, the kind of tropicality of nature that actually eats you up.
Yes.
It seems that in your project, which is also the Baroque, it's the Argentina Baroque, where has that gone? And or your architect is in reaction to it? Perhaps because the Baroque Argentina is also very colonial and very hierarchical and very patriarchal. So what is the relation to that kind of guts nature that kind of seems sanitized there?
Well,
That's a great question.
yes. It's very interesting. Most of the things we are talking about here, we are part of a society with its knowledge. We have our ADN is part of it, and we have like a long tradition of artificialization of the nature, because we are in a very plain soil where natural accidents happens kilometers one from the other. So that manipulation of the nature is a very interesting thing for us to work with. So when we think architecture, we think architecture also as a landscape and as a micro landscape in these small units. And also it is a very valorable, how do you say? It's very well received by the people who are very interested in that. So I see here that people don't own any nature in their own apartments. It's like more because of your climate. But our climate, it is very humid. That you have these big trees that are like one from 10 meters from the others, and they are 10 floors high, and they grow like this. And this is part of our culture, how we dialogue with nature and how nature introduces in our lives. About the Baroque, I don't know, because this is we are a young country, and the Baroque is we started not so far away in time. So we have reinterpretations of the Baroque through the Neoclassicism, and the Neoclassicism in our country is a copy from Europe's. So we are like a copy of the copy, and and this style problems, which Lucrezia works a lot with that, and it's fascinating, is a manipulation of the manipulation, and it's like a more pragmatic or pragmatist way of manipulating things, which we find very interesting.
But people do take some pleasure in the artificiality of it.
Yes, yes, of course, and but also not for with a knowledge and an utilization of artificiality. They do it.
Yeah.
They have their own garden, then you get inside the house, and they have all the love and all the work in a 4 by 4 meters patio with a lot of plants and tradition, and they have each plant has a story. When where does the plant comes from, and all that. So it's very important. So that's why we also introduce plants in building.
Makes sense. Okay, I think we should wrap up. I really want to thank you. If you want to see them present another lecture, they'll be. We brought them to Canada in collaboration with the CCA in Montreal, and. Sebastian, you'll be giving a lecture tomorrow night in Montreal. I want to thank Jonathan for making his way here and for adding to this, I think, important set of questions and topic for us. So, and thank all of you for coming tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.